We talked to author and veteran theme park creator Jason Surrell for the Rides That Made Me on episode 344 of the Unofficial Universal Orlando podcast. Hey everyone, I'm your host Lee, and I'm on my own, but not completely on my own. There's no Darren, no Chris, no Tracy, because I am very excited to be joined by another theme park creator. I'll introduce him in a second. But this episode is another Rides That Made Me. And if you haven't heard the previous ones, please go and find them, because I had the awesome Adam Bizark on and the wonderful Julie Zimmerman to talk about the attractions that had the biggest impact on them and their career. And this is someone we've wanted to talk to for such a long time on the show. So I would like to welcome the inimitable Jason Surrell. Hey, Jason.
Hey, Lee. How are you doing?
I am good. Thank you for joining me. This is a privilege to speak to such a theme park veteran as yourself.
It couldn't be that big a privilege. There have been 343 of these things before me. But okay.
I like to start off small and get bigger as we go on.
Thank you. That was a good recovery.
So yeah, as I said, the idea behind this segment was to invite theme park creators on the show and basically talk about 3 attractions, because I will say attractions. It started off as rides and Adam threw that out the window with his first one straight away. So it's 3 attractions that have had an impact on you as a person, Jason, and obviously your career. And it's not so much about the attraction itself, it's more about why that attraction has had that influence on yourself.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because as we said before we started recording, I think you'll find as we go on, a lot of the same attractions will come up. I'm expecting 2. One of the ones I'm expecting you to say has already been brought up. I think I know what the second one will be. The third one's a bit of a mystery to me at the moment. But I think a lot of those will keep coming up, and it's for good reason. Those attractions are fantastic, but it's why specifically that attraction had that influence on you. So why don't you go ahead and give us your first attraction?
Okay. I hope you're sitting down. Because the first attraction that had a major influence on me was the horse-drawn carriages on Main Street. No, I'm kidding. No, it's the Haunted Mansion.
Really?
I told you need to sit down. I hope you have a cocktail handy to kind of come down from this. Yeah, absolutely. The Haunted Mansion, which should surprise no one.
No. So why is that why did that attraction have such an influence on you? Just when did you ride it for the first time?
Well, I rode it for the first time at Walt Disney World in Florida, because having grown up on the East Coast in Cleveland, Ohio, or the Versailles of the Midwest, as we like to call it, Walt Disney World was obviously much more accessible to us than the original Disneyland. And the interesting thing about the Haunted Mansion in particular was, because it was a scary attraction, air quotes, scary.
Yeah.
And my parents at the time didn't necessarily know what to expect. We had taken 2 trips to Walt Disney World before I even rode it, which gave it 2 trips to build up in my mind. It had this mystique about it, and it almost gave it a little bit of a danger, because even as a little kid, you're kind of like 5, 6 years old, you're like, well, they're keeping me from this for some reason. They must have a good reason. They're my parents. And as I'm sure a lot of much like with a lot of people you've spoken to, from a very early age, I was into ghost stories, horror movies, television series like The Twilight Zone. I always had spooky streak, which I think is common to a lot of us who work in entertainment in general, and theme design in particular. So for me, the Haunted Mansion had already attained legendary status before I even rode it for the first time. So I want to say it was probably our 3rd family visit to Walt Disney World before I finally rode it, and it absolutely did not disappoint. And
how old would you have been at that point then, Jason?
At that point, probably 6 or 7, because
Wow.
I know our first visit was in 75, so I was 5. I'm dating myself, so the math is fairly straightforward. And I know they didn't let me ride it then, and we averaged 1 trip a year. For the most part, when I was growing up, we were fortunate in that regard. So I want to say it was the second or third visit, which would put me at about 6 or 7. And I never had a fearful reaction to it. I mean, there were elements of it, that would startle you or scare you a little bit, like all the pop-up ghosts, things of that nature. The attic unnerved me a little bit, but for the most part, I was under its spell from the very first ride. And everything about it, from the look of the house itself, of the mansion itself, the atmosphere, the vibe that's created when you hear the funeral dirge arrangement of Grim Grinning Ghosts right as you're going in, to the stretch room, to boarding the doom buggies, and then just proceeding into this dark sanctum. I mean, I was under its spell from the very beginning.
Yeah, it's there's not many attractions still around like that.
No, not at all. And I think that's, to me, one of the most fascinating things about attractions like the Haunted Mansion, like Pirates of the Caribbean. I mean, we're now talking, Pirates is over 50 years old. Haunted Mansion turns 50 this year. And aside from some enhancements, for the most part, they have not changed very much. And I would say pretty much exclusively the scenes that you remember most as being the most impactful, the most spectacular, the dancing ghosts in the ballroom, the singing bus in the graveyard, those effects are still predominantly the same. The ballroom is still achieved with turn of the 20th century stage magic, with the Pepper's Ghost effect. And other than, transferring from film to video for some of the projected effects, like with Leota and with the singing bus, the principle is still the same. So the notion that something like that is still firing on all cylinders and capturing the imaginations of guests of all ages 50 years later is mind-blowing. I mean, you can't say that about very many things. Some films attain that status. We're starting to see some television shows that have that staying power. But I think things like The Haunted Mansion and Pirates are, in many ways, unparalleled in terms of their staying power, their status as classics, and the fact that, by all accounts, they ain't going anywhere anytime soon. That's magic.
When you look at some of the uproar that they've had with some of the attractions that have been taken out over the past 10 or 15 years, can you imagine the uproar that would happen if Disney turned around and said, right, we're getting rid of the Haunted Mansion?
Yeah, I think there would be rioting in the streets. It's interesting to me, though, because I just purely coincidentally, I'm rereading Marty Sklar's book, Dream It, Do It, right now. And I just today, in fact, I happened to be reading the passage about how Walt very much intended Disneyland to be this sort of living laboratory where he could tear things down, build new things, replace things, refresh things. So sometimes when there is an outcry over something that is changed or replaced or closed or whatever it has to be, people are always like, oh, Walt wouldn't stand for this. And that's always kind of made me laugh, because my reaction to that is Walt is the first person that would have changed something, closed something, replaced something, if he felt that the audience had moved on or that he could do something better. I mean, that was the point of the whole thing.
So what is it about the Haunted Mansion then, Jason, that's had, because I mean, you've literally written the book on it. What is it that's had that lasting effect on you?
Well, I think I speak for a lot of people. I mentioned that I was a kid who grew up on ghost stories, horror films, spooky TV shows. I think a large cross-section of the audience loves scary things. And, some people shy away from gory horror films and they don't want to go too extreme, like with slasher movies or things like that. But for the most part, everyone loves Halloween. Everyone loves scary stuff. I think I'm reminded of the great quote from one of the all-time great designers in our industry, Eddie Sato, who came up with that tongue-in-cheek equation: fear minus death equals fun. And that is what a lot of entertainment offerings, a great book, a classic film, a popular TV series, and a theme park attraction, they allow us to live vicariously, realize our dreams, and live out some of these fantasies. So what could be more alluring to people than being given the opportunity to live out some of these darker dreams when they know at the end of the day they're perfectly safe, especially in a Disney environment. So I think that's one of the key draws of the Haunted Mansion, and has been from the very beginning. And I think the ultimate proof of that is the fact that, other than a few here and there, it is markedly, it's predominantly the same show that it's been for 50 years.
Very cool. I mean, yeah, it is. I mean, I love the attraction. You know, you can't, it's one of them, you could just get on it and stay on it and never get off, and pick up on something new every time you ride it.
Well, and that's the interesting thing, because like I've been on it, I don't know how many hundreds of times. As you said, I wrote a book on it, so I had to, I had the pleasure of walking through it, studying it up close.
Wow.
And ever since my son was born, he's about to turn 5, and he can't get enough of the Haunted Mansion, and it has never scared him either. I mean, even the things that I thought might unnerve him a little bit, he's been into it from day one. So clearly there's something in the genetics there. But as you say, even as recently as this past year, I would kind of nudge my wife and say, "Oh, did you see that before? That's brand new." So for somebody who has studied this thing up close and written a book, for somebody like that to still see things that they didn't notice before, is a testament to the brilliance of the Haunted Mansion as a piece of theme design, and the Imagineering masters, who created it.
I assume you've ridden the one out in Disneyland then?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's funny because I grew up with the one in Florida, so I became accustomed to some of these so-called extra scenes, like the music room, the grand staircase. It's a little bit longer than the Disneyland original, but it also doesn't have that walking corridor that connects the stretch room with the load area either. So they both have their unique qualities. So even though I grew up with the one in Florida, there's just something magical about going to the Disneyland original, especially after you hear some of the stories, like the facade was there for 6 years before the attraction even opened.
Yeah.
So you want to talk about building up a mystique. The Disneyland original was kind of unparalleled in that regard, because I remember when I was on the set of the film, Don Hahn, the producer, told me, I lived in Southern California, went to Disneyland all the time, and that was painful, to stand there outside that wrought iron fence, staring longingly at this house and wondering what in the world could possibly be inside. And I think, and obviously there were circumstances as to why, they waited so long, which I talk about in the book, but talk about building anticipation, and then for it to pay off like it did with such an unbelievable show, that is still going strong 50 years later. So yeah, I go back and forth with, I think I love them equally, honestly. And I really love Phantom Manor as well.
I was just going to ask about that, actually, because that's totally different. Yeah,
totally different. And it's interesting to see how core elements of the classic show were updated, by Tony Baxter and his team, for the opening of Disneyland Paris. And I love that house too, because anybody who loves sinister looking houses or haunted houses, can't miss the resemblance to another famous spooky location, the Psycho House.
Yeah.
So I remember the first time when I finally made it to Disneyland Paris, just turning that corner and seeing that house on the bluff overlooking the rivers of America. It just took my breath away. And to me, there's never going to be anything like the original show, but I definitely love what Tony and his team did with that adaptation, for a European audience, and to try to tell a different kind of spooky story in Frontierland.
And I think it is way more spooky than the US versions.
Oh, absolutely. They pushed it by design. But as I'm sure you're aware, that was a debate that went back to, the Mark Davis school of funny versus the Claude Coates school of scary. then they wound up somewhere in the middle. I definitely think with Disneyland Paris, they pushed the envelope and made it a little bit scarier, a little bit more grisly in spots, but it totally works.
Yeah. Right. So that's the first one out of the way. No surprise to anyone, as you both said. So we'll take a quick break and then we'll come back for the second one, which I'm expecting to not be much of a surprise either.
Yeah, it's a great time to take a break so people can really work up their suspense.
Mouse and Muggle Travel Company, our services are completely free to you. We don't just do Universal. We can do Disney. We can actually do anything. I don't know if anybody knows that. We can do anything. We can book absolutely anything, and it's super easy. We have a website. Just go to mouseandmuggle.com, and we have a link there for a free quote request. You just fill it out. That email comes straight to me, and either Robin or I will handle it, or if we're a little bombarded, then we'll send you off to one of our expert agents. But we'll take good care of you. So reach out to us at any time.
Welcome back. I am again joined by Mr. Jason Surrell, and we will move on to the second attraction and why it had an influence on him and his career. So Jason, give us a shock.
Okay, I know you're operating on a low budget, so a drum roll is too much to ask for. But the second attraction that really inspired me and influenced me was, wait for it, Pirates of the Caribbean.
Yeah. I find Pirates, this is an interesting one because I go back and forwards between Pirates and Haunted Mansion of which one's my favourite. I think it's one of those that on any given day, I'll prefer Mansion over Pirates, and then I ride them another day and prefer Pirates over Mansion. They are two of those, like the upper echelon of theme park attractions.
Well, it's funny you say that because that's absolutely true for me as well. And to be honest, getting ready for this podcast, I was like, well, what gets the number one spot? And for whatever reason, the barometer swung back to Haunted Mansion, but the exact same has been true for me over the years. There are times where if someone said, well, if you had to pick one, and I would say literally half the time it's Haunted Mansion, half the time it's Pirates. But the truth is I love them equally for both different and similar reasons. But the one thing you can certainly say about both of them, which we alluded to earlier, is they are both crown jewels of the Disney theme park empire. And both are bona fide classics that, as we touched on earlier, remain virtually untouched for 50 plus years now.
So when would have been the first time that you'd have rode Pirates then, Jason?
Pirates, I did ride on that first trip in 1975, which is kind of funny because it's arguably scarier in some ways for a little kid than Haunted Mansion. So you can blame my parents, I guess. But, there was just, I just remember being utterly captivated, literally from the load area, because again, growing up with Walt Disney World's version, which is the sort of abbreviated Pirates Light almost, because of some changes they made when they decided to bring it to Florida. But I remember so I didn't get the Blue Bayou or that romantic New Orleans setting that I would come to love later. But there was something about standing in the load area and looking out through that grotto at this little miniature pirate ship that appeared to be moored out at sea, and you could see the little lanterns, hanging, and to a young kid, you buy it, you think it's real. And I can still remember the sound effects, the wind, the seagulls, pirates digging in a nearby cave for treasure, and just again, what would later become sort of standard tricks of the trade for those of us who do this for a living. But experiencing it as a 5-year-old kid, all of those things working together, combined with, and I know people talk about this a lot, the scent of the water.
Yeah.
That's that great, unmistakable smell you get with any water ride.
As someone who doesn't get to go to Orlando that often, obviously living in the UK, that smell, if I smell anything that's remotely like that, it just instantly transports me back to Orlando.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as a young kid, all of those things work together to literally sweep you away. And here's a word that is commonplace today, but it's true of those attractions back then, truly immersing you
yes.
in the experience, in that story. And that's why today, some people will write articles about how, immersive entertainment is this brand new revolutionary thing. And it's like, come on, Pirates of the Caribbean and Haunted Mansion in particular were about as immersive as it gets.
Yeah.
50 years ago.
Even the queue, you look at, like, it seems to be that themed queues have just become a thing, yet they're not. They've been around for a long time. It's just they didn't do it as much as it is now.
Yeah, and today, obviously, the trend is toward immersive lands, that tell one story where all of the attractions and experiences are in support of that one story, one property. You see it with, obviously, the Wizarding World of Harry Potter. You see it with Cars Land. You see it with Pandora. And it definitely seems to be the trend, because the audience loves the opportunity to get lost in these favorite worlds of theirs. But obviously that had been taking place on an attraction level, literally for decades.
Yep.
And the great thing about both Pirates of the Caribbean and the Haunted Mansion is you don't see the seams. Once you go into that attraction, you're in the world and you stay in the world. You don't see the seams, and you're not. You don't come out of that world literally until you step back out into Adventureland, New Orleans Square, Liberty Square, whatever it happens to be.
You're killing me. I haven't ridden that thing since 2013, and now we're talking about it. It's like, I need to go back.
I can smell it now.
So what is it about Pirates that's had? I mean, we've talked about a bit there, but for you personally, how has it influenced you and your career specifically?
I would say the sheer level of, the word again, immersion and theatricality. I mean, again, for somebody who from a very early age sparked to these very atmospheric and evocative environments, I was absolutely captivated, especially starting with, because I began with the Walt Disney World version where you leave the dock and are immediately in the haunted caverns, as we call them. There was something about, being such a young kid looking around, seeing the stalactites and stalagmites, the lighting design, the waterfalls, all of it. All of a sudden you were in another world, and then hearing that sort of lonely cry of the seagull and seeing the pirates, the skeletons of the vanquished pirates on the beach. And then of course the pirate, steering the ghost ship before the drop. I was just captivated from the earliest age. And then to this day, most so at Disneyland, the moment when you emerge from that tunnel and it opens up onto the bombardment scene, I don't think anyone has done a better job of making the ceiling go away than Pirates of the Caribbean. You literally feel like, oh my God, I've emerged on the open sea. There's a pirate ship. There's a Spanish fort. We're caught in the middle, and you're there. You're in it. You are fully immersed. And then as you proceed deeper into the show, you start seeing some of Mark Davis's wonderful sight gags, Blaine Gibson's sculpted pirates look for all the world like the real thing, especially to a little kid, even though they're caricatured. You don't know that at the time. Exitencio's wonderful script, and of course the ubiquitous song, it all works together, and you're there. It's on all sides of you. It's below you in the water itself. I mean, you're on a pirate ride in the water.
Yeah.
And then you look up, and like I said, I don't think anyone's done a better job of making the ceiling go away. So for all a little kid knows, that's the cloudy night sky above. You're in that world. And I was captivated from the very first ride.
It's so atmospheric. I think atmospheric is that word you said there when you go through with the seagulls and the wind blowing and stuff. It's just that first scene is the calm, pardon the pun, the calm before the storm. But it
absolutely.
It sets that scene so well. The sound design and everything, it feels cold. You like you said, you believe that you're outside, yet you're not. And it's
there's something, especially if you ride at night, that that illusion is unsurpassed at Disneyland, where if you leave New Orleans Square at night, you go through the queue, and then you emerge onto Lafitte's Landing to board the boat. And I wrote about this in my book too. There are guests throughout time who have literally thought that they went into a building and came outside again because it's that convincing. And you want to talk about atmosphere. New Orleans Square to this day remains one of the finest pieces of theme design and one of the most successful lands in theme park history. And then I know I'm not alone in declaring my love for the Blue Bayou, both as a scene and a restaurant. To this day, it's my favorite restaurant on the planet. I could sit there for hours just soaking up that atmosphere, the moonlight, the fireflies, the sound effects, the flickering lights, the Chinese lanterns, all of it working together. That location is one of my favorite places on the planet.
And then the ride going through it as well.
Oh yeah. It totally activates the whole environment. And then, you're sitting there having dinner, and every once in a while you'll hear the distant cries of the guests going down that first hill. If you listen closely, you can hear the rushing water. I mean, there's nothing like it. And in many ways, and I wrote about this in my book as well, it really was the world's first themed restaurant, as they would come to be known later, even more so than some of the existing offerings at Disneyland, because obviously there had already been restaurants in Frontierland, Main Street, and of course those were themed. But I remember seeing, it was either a memo or a treatment, and I couldn't tell you who it was to or who it was from, but the words themed restaurant were used.
Right.
So I'm inclined to believe that was when the phrase was coined, even though no one really knew it at the time, because Blue Bayou just took what they were already doing to an even higher level of immersion and attention to detail.
See, I love that thing in theme parks where you get two, not necessarily attractions, but two separate things that come together at a specific point. So, for example, sitting in Pinocchio's village house in Fantasyland and watching the boats from It's a Small World, or going through on Big Thunder. Is it Big Thunder Mountain that goes past Splash Mountain at a specific point? Like when we used to go, and we'd always sit and have the hot dogs near Jaws at the exit to Jaws, so you were getting that interaction with the attraction while you were doing something else. Circus McGurkus in Zeus Landing. I'm a huge fan of two separate things coming together to make a singular experience. What was the other one I was going to say? The Grand Fiesta Tour and the San Angel Inn in Epcot.
Absolutely. I mean, that was designed to be, the East Coast Blue Bayou. And to this day, those points of connectivity are kind of the white whale or holy grail of theme park design. Because I can't tell you how many meetings I've been in where it's like, oh, and then we can have a restaurant right here or a retail shop right here. Because basically it's free show for both of those things.
Yeah.
So like using the Blue Bayou as an example, the fact that you're sitting in the show scene of an attraction takes it so far beyond what any conventional restaurant would be. But that wouldn't be you wouldn't build that as a standalone experience. You have to have the attraction right there. And then when you're on the ride itself, part of the story is that you're floating by this graceful old plantation house. And you see all of these people eating on the back patio with the Chinese lanterns. And you can imagine, those are the people that live there having a huge party. Maybe it's a wedding reception. It contributes to the story and experience of the attraction. And, again, to this day, that's any project I'm working on. We always look for that kind of opportunity. And it's a bit more rare than we might like, but still something to aspire to, because it makes both elements that much stronger, and it's a win-win.
Yeah, absolutely. And from a guest's point of view, it gives it more energy. It feels real.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So, Jason, we've got the two obvious ones out the way. I honestly have no clue what your last one is going to be.
Well, it's funny because it's the kind of thing where when you say it, I would think most people, and I'm not just talking about me, I'm talking about just theme park enthusiasts or designers in general, you'd be like, oh, of course. But we come forward almost 30 years, still at Disneyland, but it's Indiana Jones Adventure, which I think is probably, the way I've always described it, there was kind of a second golden age of Disney attractions around that time period, after the Renaissance that Michael Eisner and Frank Wells kind of ushered in at Disney, when you started to see things like Star Tours, Splash Mountain, Indiana Jones Adventure, Twilight Zone, Tower of Terror. And for me, Indy and Tower at Florida, specifically in Tower opened in 94, Indy opened in 95. For me, they were the sort of high watermark of this renaissance of Disney Imagineering. But for me, to this day, nothing has made me feel more like I am in one of my favorite film franchises than Indiana Jones Adventure. And again, kind of taking cues from what we've already talked about, it's the level of sheer immersion and the fact that you don't see the seams. Your Adventureland at Disneyland is already this jewel of tropical landscaping in the middle of the California desert. And the Temple of the Forbidden Eye is set back off the main path, and you kind of have to work your way up to it. And especially as the years have gone by, now everything is just so overgrown. It looks and feels like the legit jungle that it is. And then once you step inside that temple, I mean, people have been talking since 1995 about what that did to the queue experience and the role that it plays in the creation of these attractions. And then, my God, once you get on the ride itself, again, it's everything we talked about. It's the visuals, it's the visceral quality of the ride system that they developed for that attraction. It's the John Williams music. And then, of course, as Tony Baxter likes to say, and this is something that I've used in my own work ever since, he said, well, when we sat down, we thought, all right, if the average person is going to ride something called the Indiana Jones Adventure, what would they expect to see? What would they be disappointed if they didn't see? And that meant things like, well, Indy himself, the hat, the whip, the boulder, the snakes, the rats, the bugs, all of it. So for somebody like me who grew up on not only the films of Walt Disney, but certainly the films of George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, I was in the absolute sweet spot for the original Star Wars and Indy trilogies. My head pretty much exploded the first time I wrote Indy, because my reaction was, my God, they did it. I am in an Indiana Jones film.
It's something I have not ridden. I don't even actually think I've watched a ride-through video, but we used to have...
Then this podcast is over, Lee.
Hunter, one of the guys who used to be on the show with us, he raved about the Indiana Jones and the Temple of the Forbidden Eye. It was one of his favourite all-time attractions, and I trust his judgment quite a lot. It is something I'd love to get out to Disneyland. Obviously, we're a Universal podcast, but Disneyland is somewhere I really want to get out to at some point, because, again, you talk about an attraction that's, nearly 20... I'm getting old, is that right?
Yeah, well, it'd be 24 years old this year.
Again, still to be held in such high esteem by a lot of people. It's one, for all it is, like when you said this is the attraction we're going to be, and when I say it, you'll kind of go, oh yeah, it makes sense. It's not one you tend to hear people talking about as much, though, even though the people who do talk about it with such passion. It's not one that you hear people talking about a lot.
Yeah, which is surprising to me, because I have long referred to specifically Indy and Tower of Terror as modern classics, much like Pirates and Haunted Mansion are sort of golden age classics. And I mean, everyone that I know, both as a fan and a fellow designer, Indy is always right up there, especially if you're in sort of that Generation X sweet spot of Lucas Spielberg fan. I was 11, 14, and 19 when the original trilogy came out, which, again, just 11 and 14 alone for Raiders and Temple of Doom, that is the sweet spot, especially for a young boy, because obviously the Indy films are like crack for young boys. So to see that realized at age 25, it just took me right back to my childhood. And other than pretending I was behind the controls of the Millennium Falcon while I rode Space Mountain when I was a young kid, Indy was the one where it's like, okay, now we're not pretending. You are there. You are with Indy. You are experiencing these things.
It's interesting looking at your list. I think it sort of shows how theme parks have changed, because you've gone through two attractions that weren't based on IPs to one that is based on IPs, because it does seem we're getting away from those in-house created attractions now, which isn't necessarily a bad thing.
Well, it's interesting because we have that debate constantly internally. We had it at Disney, and we certainly have it at Universal, where I work now, obviously. And I think the themed entertainment industry is experiencing much the same thing that the motion picture industry is, which is
brand recognition, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That if given the choice, they're always going to err on the side of the familiar and the known. And I think it's a double-edged sword because, obviously at Universal, I have the privilege of working with some of the finest IP in the world. And at Disney, I worked on Indiana Jones content. I worked on Star Wars. I worked on Marvel. As well as classic Disney properties. I got to work on enhancements to both Pirates and Haunted Mansion. So I was finally able to contribute to some of these things that influenced me. And especially growing up as a pop culture sponge, and all of us, we're all just,
we all
slightly larger children now in air quotes adulthood. I consider it a great privilege to be a steward of any one of these wonderful intellectual properties, and it's like being given an extremely elaborate and expensive toy box, and inside that toy box are all of the action figures and vehicles and everything else that you grew up with. Only this time they're life size, and you're building an experience for people. The downside is you sometimes worry that by focusing so much on known properties, well, where's the next big Thunder Mountain Railroad going to come from? Or more to the point, where's the next Pirates or Haunted Mansion going to come from? I wouldn't ever go so far as to declare those things dead or those days over. But we just live in a world now, and like I said, it's not just the theme park industry, it's all of entertainment, where franchises kind of carry the day, and well-known characters are what these folks are going to bet on. I mean, I just read an article the other day, and it wasn't the first, about how the characters have now become more important than the actors. I mean, if you think back to as recently as the 1990s, it was get me Harrison Ford, get me Will Smith, get me Julia Roberts. And now it's, well, get me Iron Man, get me Optimus Prime, get me Harry Potter. It's the actor is secondary to the character they're playing. Yeah. And in some ways it's good, because it almost means that the story is coming first, the character is coming first. So there are benefits to that. But I think anybody who tells stories for a living, regardless of the medium, it is still hungry for fresh new ideas, original stories, things that you haven't seen before, you haven't heard before. And I think that just by virtue of the nature of creative people, I don't think that sort of thing is ever going to disappear entirely.
Good. I mean, I'll be the first one. I'm the one stood in Hogsmeade with tears streaming down my face. I'm the biggest Potter nerd ever. And the first time I walked into Hogsmeade, I could not talk to my family.
It's funny you say that, because I joined Universal the week Diagon Alley opened, so I didn't work on Hogsmeade and I didn't work on Diagon Alley, so I can feel free to brag about it all I want. Those are just masterworks of theme design, and it's for all the reasons we've been talking about. You don't see the seams; you are completely immersed. And I keep telling people, this is going back to when Dragon Challenge was still open, but one of my favorite things to do in Hogsmeade used to be to ride Dragon Challenge and consciously keep my eyes open for those moments where I would get a view of Hogsmeade or Hogwarts Castle, and then the vehicle does an inversion. Because in that moment, you're like, oh my gosh, I am flying. Yeah. And Hogwarts just turned over on itself. Those little snapshots, that's what puts you in the world of Harry Potter, and this has been written and spoken of a lot, but what Universal Creative did with both of those lands created a new benchmark in the themed entertainment industry and kind of ushered in this wonderful new era that we live in now of full and complete immersion.
And you're seeing that now with Galaxy's Edge. That's pushing it to the next level, and they'll push obviously Universal to do something else, and that competition for us as guests is fantastic.
Well, what's great about that is you just said it. Guess who wins? The audience.
Exactly.
It's like I'm a firm believer in a rising tide lifts all ships, and most of the people that I work with are fans of the product, and they love these experiences. So, if the work is good, people are going to come see it, and that's good for everybody.
It's interesting sort of going back to what we were talking about with original content and IPs. That's what makes, for me, Halloween Horror Nights such an interesting thing, that it's heavily marketed on IPs, but then they still do a lot of original content, and it always seems to be the original houses that get people, they're the ones that people are talking about at the end of the event.
It's true, and it's funny because having been part of the team that originated Halloween Horror Nights, a couple decades ago now, it's just such a joy to see what that event has become. And it's funny because I think Halloween probably does the best job of anything these days, and you just touched on it, of balancing IP and original stories. Absolutely. So it's almost like, hey, we're going to get you in here with Stranger Things and Walking Dead, but then guess what? We have half a dozen houses or whatever it is that are completely original stories, and you're not going to have any idea of what to expect. And then sure enough, people seem to love all of it. But I think if you talk to the average guest, they really dig those original stories. Yeah. And I think the answer why is obvious, because they're being treated to something new, something unexpected, something they've never seen before.
I mean, going back to our last trip out for Horror Nights 25, we talked about a game before we started recording, Insidious. That Insidious house was phenomenal. Freddy versus Jason was up there in my top 5, but Body Collectors and Jack Presents 25 Years of Monsters and Mayhem just blew everything out of the water. It was amazing.
They do such an incredible job. I can't believe I'm saying they now, since I haven't done it in quite some time. But the joy of that for me is getting to go as a guest now, and just enjoy Halloween as a guest off the street again. And, knowing that we played, along, you mentioned Julie Zimmerman earlier. She was one of my early mentors and patrons, literally gave me my first professional job in the industry with Halloween. I mean, I had done some things prior to that, but that was the first time I got paid for it, as they say. Just to go ragtag group, sometimes it felt like we were the Little Rascals trying to put on a show. Like, I've got a barn, I've got a drape, whatever. To the more sophisticated event. Now, I mean, some of these houses I walk into and just the production design is off the charts. It's all film quality.
Yeah.
And everything from the sound design to, I mean, we've had amazing makeup and costumes and prosthetics since way back in the day. But the work they're doing now is unparalleled. And again, I think it comes down to immersion. People step into those houses or into those scare zones, and for that moment, for the duration of that experience, they're in that story.
Absolutely.
And I think that's ultimately what keeps bringing the audience back to theme parks all over the world, no matter whose theme park it is. They want to be transported. They want to be immersed. They want to live it.
And I think we're testament to it as well, of older gentlemen that
a gentleman of a certain age, as I like to say,
that still want to experience those things. I think I don't know whether we're still sort of clutching at our childhoods or what it says about us as people, but everybody wants it. It's not just kids that want that experience now as well. And I think that's
not at all. I think
it.
that's a testament to the. This is going to sound so pretentious. I don't mean it to be, but it's a testament to the human spirit. I don't think you ever really grow out of that desire to be entertained, that desire to have someone tell you a story, whether you're a kid around a campfire or going into a movie theater or plopping down in front of your TV set or going into a theme park. No one should outgrow that urge, that yearning for transportation and immersion and escape. And that's what we provide in theme park design. And I think on a larger scale, it's what all great storytelling, all great entertainment is supposed to do.
Yeah, it's that escape from real life.
Yeah, absolutely. Because things are going so well in the real world.
Yeah, I was going to say, you have your problems. Yeah, we have our problems as well over here.
Exactly. And that's why it's funny, because sometimes, I'll read about, just coincidentally this week, my choir director, who put me in his show choir when I was in high school, passed away. Oh. And I had started thinking about his life and his career as an educator and what he had done over decades for thousands of students in terms of, because he's one of the reasons I have the life that I had. My time in that show choir gave me the confidence to get up in front of people and perform, which directly led to an ability to come up with ideas and have the confidence to get up in front of people and pitch them. But I was reflecting on what a remarkable, meaningful life this man had. And then sometimes you're like, oh, and here I am coming up with rides or whatever. but then you realize that I think anybody that does anything that somehow contributes to an escape for someone, I do believe there's a nobility in that, because Absolutely. Life is difficult, and everyone is in need of a respite, of escape. And to me, that's been the value that I've derived from working in theme park design, is knowing that on some level, you and your team of collaborators are creating something that is meant to make people happy, take them away from their problems for a little while, and hopefully leave them with a smile on their face. And there are worse things.
There are worse things. I think how many millions of people a year get to experience those things as well. It's massive.
Yeah, and that's that's what things like the Haunted Mansion, Pirates of the Caribbean, Indiana Jones Adventure, or on the Universal side, not to keep throwing out other attractions, but I remember riding The Amazing Adventures of Spider-Man for the first time, and that launched a whole new era of theme park design, and created a new benchmark in what full immersion could be. Yeah. And you want to talk about no seams, Spider-Man is a masterwork, but all of those things share this common purpose of just yanking people out of their everyday life and putting them someplace else for a while where they can be somebody else and sort of live out their fantasies.
Absolutely. The first time I rode Spider-Man, it left me speechless. And anyone listening to this podcast will know that's no mean feat.
Yeah, I was 29 when that opened, and oddly enough, had just recently left Universal for Disney. So I got to experience it just as a guest. I was actually the show writer for Jurassic Park, the land at Islands of Adventure. So I did work on the project over at Jurassic, but I got to go into Spider-Man cold, and I remember coming off of it just with my mouth agape, because it created visceral sensations that you had never experienced before. And very much like I described with Indiana Jones, that was one of those times where I'm like, oh my God, I am high in the sky, flying with Spider-Man, whipping around these buildings. And again, it did what all of these great attractions do, which is immerse you and take you somewhere else.
6 months till I get to come over there. This conversation is absolutely killing me at the moment. I'm so excited to get back over. Well, Jason, it's been an absolute pleasure to discuss these three attractions with. I think this is quite possibly the most Disney we've ever spoke about on this podcast. But I think we expected it, really.
Well, I mean, those were the three that it just influenced me as a person, as an audience member, and certainly I derive lessons from them and many other attractions as a theme park designer, throughout the industry over the past 25 years now. But yeah, those three, just as an audience member, were the ones that really cast a spell and kind of lured me in.
Awesome. Cool. Right, Jason, if anyone wants to keep up with anything you've got going on, is there anywhere they can follow you or any links you want to put out there for people?
I'm on Twitter still. I'm not terribly active, but just I'm at Jason Surrell on Twitter. As with any company in this industry, what we do is still pretty cloaked in secrecy. So I don't get to talk about too much until after it's open.
I mean, we discussed those books, Jason, if you want to plug the 2 books you've written.
Well, The Haunted Mansion is now, I think, in its 3rd edition. It's called The Haunted Mansion Imagineering, a Disney classic. That's still available on Amazon and pretty much anywhere. And then a lot of the other theme park books are sadly out of print now, but you can always find them on Amazon Marketplace or eBay. The Pirates book and Disney Mountains Imagineering at its Peak. I wrote a book on screenwriting called Screenplay by Disney, which kind of looks at screenwriting through the lens of the Disney animated features. And then I also wrote The Art of Marvel's The Avengers, which was kind of the tie-in art of making of book for The Avengers. And all of those are still out there on Amazon Marketplace and eBay.
Cool. Go and get them. Well, I'm pretty sure we've got a copy of the Pirates one upstairs. I'll have to double check. I'm pretty sure we have.
Yeah, that was the favorite too. The Haunted Mansion and Pirates are obviously still very near and dear to my heart, and just the fact that we got to celebrate all of the unsung Imagineers who worked with Walt to bring those things to life was a real thrill.
Awesome. Well, again, Jason, thanks for taking the time to come and speak to us. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you for having me.
Cool. So that's going to wrap up episode 344. So for Jason and myself, we will see you again next week.
Cut. Print. That's a wrap for another episode of the Unofficial Universal Orlando podcast. Never miss a show by subscribing on Apple Podcasts and leave us a rating and review while you're there. Not an Apple user? You can listen on Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, iHeartRadio, or your podcatcher of choice. Email us any questions or comments to podcast@uuopodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Google+, YouTube, Instagram, and Pinterest. Just search UUO Podcast. Keep up with the latest news, rumors, and updates on our blog at uuopodcast.com. Thanks for listening. See you next week.